Hello and welcome back to Season 7 of the MRX Lab podcast, the show from FlexMR, where this year we're on a mission to share with you tips, tricks and ideas about how to put customers at the heart of your business decisions. To help me do that, I'm thrilled to welcome back to our podcast our CMO, Chris Martin. So welcome back, Chris. It's been a few months since we last spoke. I know for a number of months now we've been collaborating with Lancaster University with a PhD on the subject of customer salience. We've not really spoken about it much before, so let's start with why. Why do that?
Excellent question. Thank you for having me back. So, since we last spoke, we have been a couple months into a PhD project with Lancaster University, like you said. And the real impetus for that was that we don't know enough about decision making. So when we at FlexMR looked at decision making as this kind of framing for what the purpose of research customer insight is and what it affects and how it spreads, we found these ideas that we expect in organizations decisions to follow a particular path. We expect them to be very linear, to be very methodical, to be very rational. That rational one is one of huge contention. And we expect them to kind of be done by committee. We expect there to be structures in place, which mean the best decision is always made for whatever outcome you're expecting, whether that's revenue, customer, etc. Realistically, that's not what happens in reality. What happens in reality is a much messier process. We see personal politics, we see emotions, we see things as basic as kind of staff changeover. You know, if the head of a department or one of your staff members leaves and a particular decision gets caught up, CMOs, the average tenure of a CMO is about 2 years. Every time a new CMO comes in, they want to bring in a new agency, new partners. It's always to leave a mark on the organization. And these are the kind of very practical concerns that get in the way of that very linear expected decision-making process. So what we wanted to do was kind of find out more about how decisions are really made and how customer insight and customers can influence that, and how we can measure that, and ideally how we can kind of quantify that decision-making culture.
So as you're talking there, I'm thinking about decisions, and I'm thinking about how we as researchers understand decision-making, because actually as researchers, we know a lot about decision-making. It tends to be consumer decision-making. We know a lot about how consumers make decisions. What's the fundamental difference between understanding a consumer decision and then understanding a business decision?
Yeah, so when we looked at, first of all, let's start with just the vast gulf between how much we know about consumer decision-making and organizational decision-making. When we did a review of how much literature there is on both academically, there is 4 times as much literature on consumer decision-making as organizational decision-making. And actually, that's kind of strange, because organizational decision-making is significantly more complicated than consumer decision-making. We have overanalyzed, potentially, consumer decision-making and the cognitive processes which are fundamental in that. And in consumer decision-making, there are cognitive and there are social processes. But in organizational decision-making, it is much more effective, yes, by cognitive, that doesn't disappear, yes, by social pressures, but also structural, contextual, and these kind of team factors as well. How is the organization structured? Who is involved in that decision-making process? It becomes vastly more complicated.
You're saying it's become vastly more complicated, I think, because of what I would call the systemic side of decision making. Because what you've argued there is all the complexity of a consumer decision exists because we're human beings, right? An organisation is stacked out with human beings. So our decision making as a human being is going to be the same, I would imagine, similar as a consumer or a business person. But in the context of a business, our behaviour changes because of the system that we are part of, the processes, the structures, the data systems, the politics around it. But it's the system that we're adding on top. Is that fair, that we've almost see it almost as systemic and emotional, which is different to the consumer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd maybe call what we call emotional cognitive, the cognitive factors of decision making. But then, yeah, in organizations, you have this whole other set of structures and systems that are primarily designed as guardrails, and that's where they come from, right? To ensure consistency, to ensure that we reduce the influence of those cognitive and emotional factors. In reality, do they do that? I don't think so.
Right, so that's an interesting point. So is that why, when we've looked at it, there's less literature on it, and why the literature from a commercial angle, I'm not talking about academic angle, in a commercial context, often portrays decision making as linear, because the system is linear, and because we think the system has somehow removed the cognitive and the emotional?
Of course, yeah. If an organization was made up entirely of AIs, it would be perfect, in the sense that there would be none of this messy cognitive or emotional factors affecting how the decisions are made. They would be linear. In reality, as you said, organizations are made of humans. So not only do we then bring back in those cognitive and emotional factors, but we also add these politics. We add these things that arise because of structures. Which departments get on with which ones hold budget, what is a particular agenda behind a decision, how are the power differentials between, say, marketing and finance structured in your organization, how much budget do they have access to, all of those things which should be making decisions kind of very simple come into conflict all the time. So when we think of things like purchasing committees, procurement is a great example, because procurement is, in theory, the most rigid decision you can make. A lot of it is based on scorecards. How well did you score on quality, on value, on cost? Quality, that's not very easy to score though, is it? So who's making the decisions about what quality is? Do they have pre-preferences for a particular supplier? Are there kickbacks somewhere in that process? All of these things which, when we kind of flatten them down and put them on a score sheet and put a number next to it which says 3 out of 5, really hides the complexity behind it.
Which also interesting, when we're getting into this, I remember also the PhD is obviously framed under the customer salience subject that we've been talking about now for a couple of years. What's the ultimate goal of the PhD at the end of the 3 or 4 years that it takes? Is there an ultimate goal behind it? At the end, an end result almost?
Ideally, we would love to have this quantification, this way of standardizing and understanding customer salience across organizations, to be comparative. And obviously there's kind of a time comparison and a cross-organization comparison. Can you measure your improvements?
Okay.
Beyond that, of course, a more deep understanding of where customer salience arises from, what the practices are that lead to a culture of customer.
And is that where decision making comes in then? Decision making comes in because ultimately it's almost like the engine of connection between the customer and the ultimate decision that's being made. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand the propensity to which the customer is in those decisions. And if we're trying to measure them, I guess what we need to understand is the role of decision and what good and bad looks like, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. We need a better evidence base of what is good decision making, what is bad decision making. And those are very subjective terms, but we need to put some guardrails around, or at least ideas around what good decision making could look like. Now, in customer salience, good decision making has an element of customer thinking in it. That's what we have very little data about right now. To what extent is the customer in that process?
But I'm also thinking about terms like customer centricity, customer focus, customer orientation. These terms have been around for a while anyway. We're building customer salience on top of that as a way of understanding that process. Do you think that, well, we don't know obviously because the PhD is looking at it, but do we think, or would your contention be, that organisations that might score highly on customer salience or be called customer centric are we going to find that they've got different cultures or different processes? Is there going to be some similarity? Or maybe there's no similarity, it's just the framework for understanding that decision?
That's a really good question. Come back to me in 2 or 3 years.
That is the PhD, right?
That is one of the outcomes. But also, where I would contend is on whether or not, of course, we're building customer salience on top of these pre-existing ideas of customer centricity and customer culture. What I think has been missing to date in this kind of discourse is the decision making, and is the reflection of understanding and actually implementing cultures of customer is not about having more customer data. And I think at the moment that is where a lot of organizations go wrong, that thinking that creating a culture of customer centricity means we have to have more customer data.
Right. So
and not we have to understand how our organization makes decisions better so that we can take what we already have and marry it into the decision-making process.
Right. So at that point, the wording almost is the difficulty, because customer centricity says I'm going to put the customer at the heart of it, at which point what I'm going to do is understand the customer to the nth degree. And what you're saying is that's led us almost into this world where we've got, I think you referenced it, how many thousand, 204 times, you said 4 times more.
We've got 228,000 studies on consumer decision making and only 66,000 on organizational decision.
Okay, right. So that's the point you're making there, that the word customer centricity leads us into that belief that the more understanding of the customer we get and put into organization, it automatically translates into a customer salient organization.
Yeah, so we, at the moment, I'm not sure we can conclude that having more data or having research teams spend longer looking at customers is translating to better outcomes. In fact, if we look at the customer gap, there is this huge belief in executives. Over 75% of executives say that customer centricity is important. Only about 15% of them believe that their customer is doing it, that their organization is doing it really well. There's belief in the idea and a gap with being able to deliver or achieve it. And these aren't organizations that aren't running research programs. They have brand trackers, they have NPS, they have CSAT scores. All of these metrics are there, but they're not translating into actually putting customers into decisions. That's the kind of gap we're trying to fill. And the argument, the logic we have is that you're not going to do that just by adding more indicators, more scores, more research projects. You're going to do it by taking all of that, which you've already done such a good job of building, and reflecting it inwards, understanding, taking the skills that researchers have, understanding, unpacking how the organization really operates, what the opportunities are, beyond project debriefs, beyond even kind of long-term programs, to build things like customer intuition, customer muscle, so that it is reflexive, that it's kind of almost automatic, that when anyone from staff on the shop floor to senior executives are making decisions, that there is a, how does this affect the customer?
Which is where decision making comes in. Your argument there is that the missing point in that discourse on customer centricity is we look at the customer, we've forgotten to think about decisions and how decisions get made, and therefore we don't really understand to what extent all that customer understanding comes into those decisions. You're now bringing in topics of intuition and customer muscle, which comes back to the humanization of customer. I know we've talked about this before, which I think is absolutely fascinating. It intuitively, again, intuitively, there's that word, makes sense. But before we talk about decision making almost in a logical process of analysis, and now we're talking about intuition and customer muscle. How do we as researchers, who often almost science this a little bit in our understanding of customer decision making, it's a science almost, social science may be, how do we then marry up all of that thought process with that word customer muscle and customer intuition? What is the process of that in decision making?
So I would argue that the answer is we need to be scientists and artists. We need to have deep qualitative and quantitative understanding of customers, and we need to have an ability to use that to influence decision making in the direction that we want to see, which is obviously by getting that kind of customer insight into that process. There are aims to quantify that. One of the objectives of the PhD is to provide a tool which enables you to have some kind of benchmark indicator and be able to say, okay, so this is how well we're doing at achieving that, and then kind of compare year on year, month on month, how your progress is. But in terms of the kind of tactics and the very practical ways of influencing that decision-making process, that is an art form, and that is about building relationships. That is about being persuasive. That is about understanding how your organization operates, who your coalitions are, who your networks are, who can support you in that goal, through what routes momentum is built, what the barriers are going to be, and how you can overcome them. There is a huge amount of understanding, but it's very contextual. It's very much about your business, and it's very much reliant on a set of skills that we don't often tap into as researchers.
It's very true. We don't tap into them. Again, when thinking about intuition, I'm thinking about where decisions get made. Again, I don't think we understand this often as a researcher. We do a research debrief, for example. We've given our recommendations, so we assume that we've influenced the decision. But the reality has to be that the decisions aren't necessarily being made in that room where we are. The decision to actually influence something will be taken somewhere else. And I don't think we're thinking enough about where the decisions are being made, because if we change that frame of reference to that point, we need to make sure that memory almost comes into it. So when we're not in the room and that piece of research has been used, that the customer's still coming to mind.
And this is where tools like and we've run workshops on this in the past, this is where tools like systems mapping are incredibly useful, and network actor mapping, overlaying, get a huge whiteboard, put on it sticky notes. Who is making decisions about what, where, with what data? Map all of those connections out. That gives us a great starting point to figuring out what the shape of our organizational decision making is, and then going into those rooms, being persuasive, making the customer insight land, stick, live beyond, build intuition. That's the art form that we need to layer on top of it.
Yes, and the art form there, that's where the intuition, I guess, comes into it. But I think your point is more than that. If we think about where the decisions are made, maybe my mind changes from the debrief and the actions and the recommendations and the project framing, and maybe my mind starts to think about more the way in which we leave and create memory, the way in which we create that understanding, so that when we're not there, there's a customer muscle. I think you used that word, which I really like.
Absolutely. We're very unlikely to ever escape a world where researchers are expected to deliver projects. That's always going to be a part of the researcher's role. But thinking about the brief of influencing decision making to me, opens up this kind of whole new range of possibilities about what our jobs as researchers can be. And I think there's some really exciting stuff we can kind of get into in terms of how you do that. I love the idea of internal communications campaigns, of customer podcasts, of custom-built card games and board games. I've seen a couple done incredibly well. Just left in break rooms where people who wouldn't normally engage with customers from kind of maybe operations departments or accounting can come in an environment they're not really expecting. And I think that's an important point too from advertising, disruption. So reaching people when they're not expecting it, creating memory structures. We've run things like Insiders art projects where we translate how customers think about a brand into these very visceral artistic representations across a huge range of mediums, and then present it back to kind of senior stakeholders and say, how do you interpret this? And those kind of unexpected interruptions really have a huge long-term impact. And when we can get people to question their own heuristics, biases, assumptions, and really start understanding that they have those and that they need to understand the customer better, that's when I think Customer Salience will have been a success.
Right. And I think that is, going back to our beginning point, that's the heart of the PhD. That's understanding decision making, understanding the differences between organizations that have good customer centricity or high customer salience, and then ultimately being able to measure it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that is another great note to end on. So thank you again, Chris, for joining me again on the MRX Lab podcast. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you too to the audience for tuning in. We may be out of time today, but I'll be back next month with another episode where I'll be sharing more inspiring stories about how to put customer insight at the heart of decision making. Until then, I've been your host, Paul Hudson, and this has been the MRX Lab podcast.